Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
No one expected Eddie Murphy to be the calmest person at the view table that morning. He walked out smiling, waving to the audience, cracking a quick joke about how he hadn't been on a daytime couch this intense since the 80s. The crowd laughed. Joy Behar laughed too. For a moment, it felt light, familiar, safe. Then the topic card came up. Should critical race theory be included in all history curriculums? The laughter faded fast. Joy framed it as a necessary correction, a way to finally tell the full American story instead of a polished version. Eddie nodded at first, listening closely, letting her finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. That made what came next hit harder. Eddie said he supported teaching hard history, but questioned whether turning one academic framework into a mandatory lens for every classroom actually helped kids understand the past, or just trained them what to think about it. The audience reacted instantly. Applause mixed with sharp gasps. Joy leaned in. Her tone shifted from conversational to precise. She asked Eddie why acknowledging systemic racism made so many people uncomfortable. Eddie didn't dodge it. He said discomfort wasn't the issue. Simplification was. That's when the table stiffened. This wasn't a comedian playing devil's advocate. This was Eddie Murphy, measured and serious, warning about education turning into ideology instead of inquiry. Joy pushed back just as firmly, arguing that avoiding frameworks like CRT was how generations were taught incomplete truths. Within minutes, producers were glancing at each other. The panel stopped smiling. The audience stopped knowing when to clap. What began as a discussion about curriculum suddenly became a referendum on power, truth, and who gets to define how history is taught to the next generation. And Eddie Murphy was not backing down. Eddie Murphy took his seat at the table to a long, warm round of applause. Joy Behar leaned over with a grin, joking that it had taken decades to finally get him into a daytime debate instead of a late-night monologue. Eddie laughed, playing along, saying he promised not to do stand-up unless things got really awkward. The audience relaxed. So did the panel. The opening minutes felt easy. Whoopi framed the discussion carefully, reminding viewers that the conversation around critical race theory had become emotionally charged, often without clarity about what it actually meant. Eddie nodded, listening closely, hands folded, eyes focused. He didn't rush in. Joy began by explaining why she believed critical race theory mattered. She described it as a tool, not an attack, a way to examine how laws, institutions, and policies shape racial outcomes over time. Her tone was calm, instructional, almost reassuring. This wasn't a confrontation yet, it was a setup. Eddie responded with agreement on the surface. He said he supported teaching the full truth about American history, including slavery, segregation, and systemic discrimination. He made it clear he had no interest in sugarcoating the past. The audience applauded, relieved to hear common ground. He added that kids deserved honesty, not comfort. That line landed well. Joy nodded, smiling slightly, but Eddie didn't stop there. He shifted gently, saying his concern wasn't about teaching racism. It was about how it was being taught. He questioned whether framing all history through one theoretical lens risked narrowing curiosity instead of expanding it. He stressed that classrooms should invite questions, not prescribe conclusions. Joy tilted her head, still friendly but alert. She asked him to clarify what he meant by prescribe. Eddie explained that critical race theory began as a legal framework, not a K-12 teaching tool. He said pulling concepts down into every grade level without nuance could confuse students more than educate them. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Joy pushed back lightly. She said frameworks existed to help people see patterns they might otherwise miss. She argued that without tools like CRT, students often learned history as isolated events rather than connected systems. Her tone stayed even, measured. Eddie nodded again, acknowledging the point. He said patterns mattered, context mattered, but he worried about replacing one simplified narrative with another. He talked about his own school experience, learning dates and names without understanding motives or consequences. He said adding another rigid framework wouldn't automatically fix that. Sonny chimed in, pointing out that CRT wasn't about blame, but about awareness. Eddie agreed in principle. He said awareness was essential. His concern, he repeated, was compulsion. Making one framework mandatory, he said, risked turning education into ideology. The room shifted slightly. Nothing explosive yet, but the ease from earlier had softened. Joy smiled, but it was a testing smile now. She asked Eddie why he thought students couldn't handle a framework that challenged dominant narratives. Eddie responded calmly, saying kids could handle complexity, but only when it was presented as exploration, not doctrine. The audience stirred. Some clapped. Others stayed quiet. For a moment, the conversation hovered in that fragile middle space where disagreement still felt respectful. Eddie stayed composed, almost philosophical. Joy remained engaged, but her questions grew sharper, more focused. The smiles faded. The jokes stopped. Because beneath the polite exchange, a deeper divide was forming, not about whether racism should be taught, but about who decides how truth is framed and whether education should guide thinking or provoke it. And as Joy leaned in to press her next question, it was clear the conversation was about to leave the safe zone. Joy didn't waste time easing into it. She asked Eddie why the idea of making critical race theory part of every history curriculum triggered so much resistance if, as he said, he supported teaching the truth. Her tone was still controlled, but the edge was there now, the kind that signaled the conversation was moving out of neutral territory. Eddie leaned back slightly, then forward again. He said resistance didn't come from fear of truth, it came from fear of oversimplification. He argued that when one framework became mandatory, it stopped being a tool and started becoming a filter. Everything passed through it, whether it fit or not. Joy pushed back immediately. She said American history had already been filtered for generations, just in the opposite direction. Ignoring systemic racism, she argued, wasn't neutrality, it was bias. And CRT existed precisely because traditional curriculums failed to tell the whole story. The audience applauded loudly. Eddie waited, then responded calmly. He said he didn't disagree with the diagnosis, he disagreed with the prescription. Fixing a broken system, he said, didn't require locking every classroom into one ideological lane. Sonny jumped in, pointing out that CRT wasn't about ideology, but about analysis. She said frameworks didn't dictate beliefs, they helped students ask better questions. Eddie acknowledged that in theory. In practice, he said, it depended on how it was taught and who was doing the teaching. Joy raised an eyebrow. She asked if he trusted teachers. Eddie smiled faintly and said he trusted teachers as individuals, not mandates as a system. He said once something became compulsory nationwide, nuance tended to disappear. That landed harder than expected. Joy leaned forward, her voice sharper now. She said children across the country were already being taught distorted versions of history that erased racism entirely. She asked why that lack of nuance never seemed to alarm people as much as the inclusion of CRT. Eddie nodded, conceding the point. He said that was a fair criticism, but then he added that swinging to the opposite extreme wasn't balance, it was reaction. And reaction, he warned, rarely produced good education. The audience murmured. Some clapped, others crossed their arms. Joy accused him of framing equity as extremism. Eddie pushed back, saying he wasn't opposing equity, he was opposing dogma. He said history should be taught with multiple lenses, not one elevated above all others. Joy responded that multiple lenses had existed for decades, and most of them conveniently ignored race. CRT, she argued, forced institutions to confront patterns they had long denied. Making it optional, she said, meant it would be avoided. That's when Eddie's tone changed. He said forcing any framework created backlash that hurt the very goals it aimed to achieve. He said parents and students shut down when they felt told what conclusions to draw. Education, he argued, should invite thinking, not demand agreement. Joy cut in, asking whether acknowledging systemic racism really demanded agreement, or simply honesty. Eddie replied that honesty became complicated when frameworks were presented as settled truth rather than evolving scholarship. The panel started talking over one another. Whoopi tried to slow the pace, but the momentum kept building. Joy said students were already inheriting the consequences of systems built on racism. Shielding them from that reality, she argued, was doing them a disservice. Eddie responded that teaching reality didn't require labeling children as oppressors or victims. Joy bristled. She said that was a misrepresentation. CRT, she insisted, wasn't about labeling individuals. It was about examining systems. Eddie replied that distinction often got lost once the theory left universities and entered classrooms. Applause and boos collided. The audience was fully divided now. Joy accused Eddie of underestimating students' ability to think critically. Eddie shot back that he was defending it. He said real critical thinking meant being allowed to question the framework itself. The temperature in the room rose. Voices sharpened. Interruptions piled up. This was no longer a polite disagreement about curriculum design. It was a fundamental clash over whether education should guide students towards specific interpretations of history or equip them to challenge every interpretation, including the ones in power. And the emotional flashpoint was coming fast. The air in the studio grew heavy. What had started as an intellectual debate about frameworks had suddenly become deeply personal. Joy leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough to draw attention as she spoke about children growing up unaware of the realities of systemic oppression. She described classrooms where history was sanitized, pain invisible, and the mistakes of the past framed as distant, almost irrelevant. Her eyes searched Eddie's for acknowledgement, for any sign that he understood the urgency she felt. Eddie nodded slowly. He said he understood the concern, that he didn't want students to be shielded from truth, but then he added something that hit a nerve. He said he worried that turning critical race theory into a mandated lens for every history lesson risked replacing one incomplete narrative with another. The goal, he argued, should be education that provokes inquiry and independent thought, not instruction that signals right and wrong thinking. Joy's smile, already thin, disappeared completely. She leaned in, voice sharper, carrying both disappointment and exasperation. She asked Eddie if he truly thought children were incapable of understanding patterns of oppression without being forced into ideological boxes. She accused him of intellectualizing the pain of communities who had been ignored for centuries. The audience shifted in their seats. Some nodded in agreement, others gasped at the intensity of her words. Eddie's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. His tone remained calm, but the controlled veneer was cracking. He said he was not dismissing anyone's pain. He was insisting that learning required room to explore, to question, and to grapple with uncomfortable truths independently. He warned that mandates could alienate students, turning curiosity into resentment. Teaching, he insisted, should inspire engagement, not compliance. Joy's gaze intensified. She argued that systemic issues couldn't wait for debate or gradual understanding. She said children already lived with the consequences of inequity daily. She asked Eddie whether he believed students could face those consequences without the guidance of a structured framework. She punctuated the question with a sharp, almost incredulous glance that drew murmurs from the audience. Eddie leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in urgency. He said frameworks were tools, not solutions. He said imposing one framework universally could inadvertently silence critical discussion rather than foster it. He reminded the panel that independent thinking was what ultimately allowed students to recognize injustice and push for change. The audience reacted audibly. Some cheered, others groaned. The studio felt divided, palpable tension filling every corner. Joy cut in, her voice firmer now, challenging him directly. She said Eddie's insistence on choice sounded like delaying progress. That framing systemic racism as optional or up for debate minimized the real-world harm many students experience daily. She accused him of prioritizing theoretical purity over practical justice. Eddie's expression hardened. He said he wasn't minimizing harm. He was advocating for teaching students how to think, not what to believe. He said that critical engagement required both guidance and freedom, and that stripping one away in favor of mandates could backfire, leaving students resistant rather than enlightened. The audience was silent, the weight of the exchange settling over them. Even Whoopi, usually quick to interject, paused, sensing the moment had reached a delicate, almost combustible peak. The conversation had moved beyond policy, pedagogy, or academic theory. It had become a test of empathy, philosophy, and trust in the next generation's ability to wrestle with truth. And in that pause, every viewer knew the next turn of the debate would be explosive. The breaking point was imminent. The tension in the studio became almost tangible. Joy's voice cut sharply through the quiet, no longer gentle or measured. She asked Eddie why he seemed more concerned with abstract theory than with real children suffering from generations of systemic injustice. Her words weren't just challenging, they were pointed, almost accusatory. The audience reacted instantly, some nodding vigorously, others murmuring in disagreement. Eddie leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair. His usual composure faltered for the first time, though he didn't shout. His tone was controlled but firm. He said he wasn't dismissing anyone's suffering. He was questioning whether mandates and ideological rigidity were the right way to help children understand history. He argued that forcing a single lens risked alienating students who might otherwise engage thoughtfully, turning classrooms into battlegrounds instead of spaces for learning. Joy interrupted, her voice rising. She accused him of intellectualizing pain, of being more invested in academic purity than justice. She said that children didn't have the luxury of abstract debate. They were living the consequences of inequality now. Eddie responded, his patience thinning, saying that understanding consequences required context, critical thinking, and room to process, not just adherence to one prescribed framework. Sonny jumped in, attempting to moderate, reminding both sides that the discussion needed nuance. Eddie nodded briefly but continued, saying that nuance was exactly what was being stripped away when CRT was treated as mandatory for all students, in every classroom, regardless of local context or teaching style. Joy shot back, asking if he thought students couldn't handle uncomfortable truths, if he believed confronting systemic injustice needed to be optional. Marking the tipping point, Eddie's voice sharpened. He said the real risk was creating resentment rather than understanding. Compulsory frameworks could make students defensive, confused, or even cynical, undermining the very lessons the curriculum aimed to teach. Joy's eyes narrowed and she leaned in, insisting that children were resilient and capable of grappling with the truth when guided properly. She argued that optional frameworks had repeatedly failed to equip students with the tools to recognize patterns of discrimination. The studio grew louder. Applause and murmurs collided. Whoopi tried to intervene, reminding everyone to let each other speak. But Joy was relentless. She pressed Eddie, challenging him directly. Why fear a framework that aimed to illuminate truths long ignored? Why prioritize comfort over justice? Eddie shook his head, frustration showing in every line of his face. He said it wasn't comfort he was defending, it was thoughtfulness. He stressed that education without independent analysis was no education at all. Joy's tone became almost incredulous. She accused Eddie of defending a system that had already failed countless students, framing his caution as complicity in maintaining inequality. Eddie's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice low but intense. He said labeling disagreement as moral failure created division rather than learning. He said that moral certainty didn't teach children to think critically. It taught them to obey authority blindly. The audience reaction split immediately. Half cheered for Eddie, applauding his defense of critical thought. Half sided with Joy, shouting agreement that children needed frameworks to confront real inequities. The cacophony highlighted the depth of the divide, mirroring the national debate over education itself. Producers exchanged urgent glances. Camera operators shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi tried to regain control, but the moment had already reached its peak. Joy accused Eddie of underestimating the moral stakes of the debate. Eddie accused Joy of underestimating the power of intellectual freedom. It was clear to everyone in the room the discussion had moved beyond policy, theory, or pedagogy. This was now a clash over principles, values, and the very purpose of education. And as the panel reluctantly agreed to a commercial break, it was undeniable. This debate wasn't just heated, it had shattered the fragile civility of the studio, leaving viewers unsettled, questioning, and deeply engaged. When the cameras cut to a wider shot after the break, the energy in the studio was palpably different. Eddie Murphy sat quietly, leaning back, collecting himself. Joy Behar adjusted her notes, her expression still sharp but reflective. The producers guided the conversation toward a softer topic, but the intensity of what had just occurred lingered, almost like a charge in the air. The debate over critical race theory hadn't ended neatly. It hadn't been resolved with polite nods or compromise. Instead, it left a clear impression. Education isn't just about facts and dates, it's about interpretation, guidance, and the responsibility to prepare young minds to think critically about complex truths. Online, the reactions exploded within minutes. Clips of Eddie's reasoning and Joy's sharp rebuttals circulated rapidly. Some viewers praised Eddie for defending intellectual freedom and critical inquiry, applauding his insistence on encouraging independent thought in classrooms. Others sided firmly with Joy, arguing that her push for structured frameworks like CRT was necessary to confront systemic inequities long ignored. Social media was divided, debate spilling into comment sections, podcasts, and opinion columns. What stood out most wasn't who won the argument. It was how uncomfortably real the conversation felt. This wasn't a scripted clash. It was a reflection of the broader national conversation about history, education, and morality. Eddie and Joy's confrontation made clear that questions about curriculum go beyond pedagogy. They're about empathy, authority, and what society expects children to understand about the world they inherit. The tension highlighted something crucial. Teaching history isn't neutral. Every lesson conveys values, implicitly and explicitly. And whether through frameworks like CRT or alternative approaches, educators face the challenge of presenting complexity without indoctrination and truth without paralysis. Eddie argued for exploration, inquiry, and debate. Joy argued for clarity, structure, and accountability. Both perspectives exposed the stakes and contradictions inherent in any discussion of education. By the end of the show, there was no tidy resolution. No consensus was reached, but the conversation had sparked something far larger: reflection. Viewers were forced to confront questions they might have avoided, about fairness, about responsibility, and about how society balances truth, justice, and critical thinking in shaping future generations. If you felt torn watching this exchange, you weren't alone. The discomfort, the intensity, and the split perspectives were part of what made the conversation unforgettable. Education isn't just about teaching history. It's about challenging assumptions, inviting dialogue, and grappling with the realities of the past. If you liked this powerful moment, make sure to subscribe for more emotional showdowns, cultural debates, and unforgettable TV clashes. Drop a comment below. Should critical race theory be included in all history curriculums, or should students explore history without a mandated framework?